Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. So today we embark on a discussion of a new chapter. And if you recall in my previous lectures, we talked about in the early colonial era, after the colonists had just arrived, how it was really a battle for survival. I even made the comparison to an episode of Survivor or one of these other television shows. So how do we go from that to a period in which the colonies, by the eve of the American Revolution, were much more well-structured, unified, and together? Well, that's the period we're going to be discussing over these next several lectures, the period of Colonial America, and we're going to be talking about a variety of different elements of life in the British colonies. To begin, we should note that as the colonies grew, there were two trends developing simultaneously. On the one hand, the colonies are, of course, English and tied in a number of ways to the mother country of England. Down the road, of course, we're going to talk about the rebellion against that sort of control, but in the period we're discussing now, colonists, for the most part, considered themselves English and in many ways mimicked the society and culture of the mother country. At the same time, though, over time, the colonists developed a uniquely American identity. Increasingly, generations of people are born in the colonies who've never been to England, and to identify less and less with those ties to England. So by the end of the period that we're discussing in these lectures, there are families who've been in the colonies for 5 or 6 generations, born in America rather than England. So there is an American identity evolving as well. And just to note, the picture that you see here is a figure named Francis Brinley of Boston, who immigrated from England but then lived in Boston. He represents this kind of elite English gentry and the replication of English society in the Americas. And just to reiterate this, we need to review a concept that I talked about briefly in a previous lecture, and that is the idea of triangle trade. The essential idea behind triangle trade is that there were 3 main hubs of trade during the colonial era, creating a cycle of migration and trade revolving throughout the Atlantic world. These 3 hubs, as you can see in this chart, are England, or Great Britain, the Americas, and Africa. So recall that in a previous lesson I talked about the idea of mercantilism, meaning that the Americas existed essentially to provide raw materials to England and Europe. That was the English view anyway. So in the Americas they grew staple crops like tobacco, rice, sugar, indigo, hemp, silk, and others, which were then shipped to England to be processed. So England and Europe processed those goods and provided clothing, tools, furniture, paper, and luxury items which would then be sent back to the colonies. Much of the wealth generated in both regions then went to the purchase of African slaves, and it was on their labor that was the foundation upon which all of these other goods and products were produced. As the colonies grew, colonial elites modeled themselves after the English gentry. The homes and parlors of colonial elites would have contained furniture and luxury goods like that in England. You might have seen chairs, couches, and drapes and other items that were common in English homes. Growing numbers of homes in the colonies would include a desk where they could engage in correspondence and commerce and organize records of trades and purchases. One particular mark of prosperity was a portrait or portraits of family members. For many of the American elite at the state and national level, we have portraits which provide us a sense of what these folks looked like and what they wore. Let's consider one example to get a sense of the process involved in the consumer habits in the colonies. So consider the dress of one colonial elite, Eliza Pinckney of South Carolina. The silk and dyes that went into the dress were grown on the Pinckney plantations of South Carolina, where they grew indigo, rice, and other products. These raw materials were shipped to England, where they were made into cloth, which was then shipped back to South Carolina to be made into the fashionable dress pictured here. With all the time, money, and labor invested in a single dress, we should note that few families could afford even one fancy dress, and many Americans functioned in that era with only a few changes of clothes at all. This is part of why fancy clothes become one marker of social status in the Americas. The colonies also reflected architectural styles popular in Europe at that time. Brick buildings, in some cases 2 or 3 stories tall, conveyed a message of stability and permanence in a world that was once fraught with uncertainty. Governance in the colonies also had its roots in English society, but evolved some unique features in the Americas. The American colonies were governed by local assemblies. Without an established nobility or gentry class with generations of wealth, American assemblies tended to include elected officials rather than those who inherited their positions. This early trend gave the colonial assemblies a democratic flavor that was not as prominent in England. And while most positions in these assemblies were won by those from wealthy and prominent families, there were opportunities for self-made men or those from lower classes to win seats. Thus, government in the colonies resembled, but didn't perfectly replicate, British rule. Each colony was also ruled by a governor from England. However, the salaries of those governors depended on a vote from the assemblies, so they more or less had to work in concert with the assemblies if they wanted to be paid. So throughout the period we are discussing, the colonies worked more or less peacefully with England. Britain essentially let the colonies rule themselves, as long as they were providing the motherland with wealth and resources, as a philosophy that scholars have called benign neglect or salutary neglect, leaving the colonies alone. As we will discuss in the next chapter, it is the intensification of British rule, a tightening of the reins, in the 1750s and 60s that begins to drive the colonies toward rebellion. But we're not there yet.